Imagine being so utterly terrified of the dark that on your deathbed, while you are literally gasping for your final breaths, you use your last ounce of strength to force your secretary to swear a blood oath.
Right, a literal oath.
Yeah, you make him promise, absolutely guarantee that he will not let your body be buried for at least 3 full days. I mean, you are petrified of waking up inside a pine box, 6 feet under, just screaming into the dirt. And, that wasn't some paranoid character from an Edgar Allan Poe story. That was George Washington.
It is an incredibly raw, almost disturbing detail to find in the historical record because we are so conditioned to see him as this unflinching, untouchable figure.
Right. Usually when we look at the face on the $1 bill or, we stare up at the Washington Monument, there's this expectation of absolute perfection.
Yeah.
It's a marble statue, it's clean, it's stoic, and it's completely binary. But when you step past that mythology, which is what we are doing today, that marble shatters. So welcome to the deep dive. Today we are opening up a massive stack of encyclopedic entries, historical briefs from the Miller Center, and incredibly detailed life recaps about the father of his country.
And the mission today is to really find the actual human being buried under 2.5 centuries of hero worship.
Yeah, we are looking at a flawed, highly ambitious, and insanely resilient man whose greatest triumphs, honestly, almost always came directly on the heels of completely humiliating failures.
That is the essential theme you have to keep in mind here. If you read through these encyclopedic accounts, the first thing that really hits you is that Washington wasn't a tactical military genius. I mean, he lost more battles than he won.
Wait, really? More than he won?
Oh, absolutely. And he also wasn't a highly educated philosophical scholar like, say, Thomas Jefferson or James Madison. His actual superpower, the thing that allowed him to essentially forge a nation, was his sheer, unadulterated will to survive.
Just pure grit.
Pure grit. It was his capacity to learn from disastrous mistakes, and ultimately his completely unprecedented willingness to surrender absolute power once he actually had it.
Okay, well, let's unpack that survival instinct.
Yeah.
Because to understand the man who outlasted the entire British Empire, we really have to start with an inexperienced teenager who accidentally started a global war.
Right.
Which I know sounds like hyperbole, but it's exactly what happened.
It is not hyperbole at all. And the setup for that disaster really starts with his childhood. So George Washington was born in 1732 in Virginia, but the trajectory of his entire life was violently derailed when his father, Augustine, died. George was only 11 years old at the time.
And in the 18th century Virginian aristocracy, losing your father that early meant losing your ticket to the upper echelon, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it completely cut off his chances for a formal classical education. He didn't get to go to college in England like his older half-brothers did.
Precisely. In that era, the wealthy elite sent their sons to places like the Appleby School in England to study, Latin, Greek, and ancient philosophy. Washington was totally denied that.
Which had to hurt.
Oh, he was incredibly self-conscious about this lack of formal education his entire life. It was a huge chip on his shoulder. So instead, his education was purely practical. He learned mathematics, drafting, and most importantly, surveying.
Okay, survey.
Yeah, and here is where his older half-brother, Lawrence, becomes critical. Lawrence basically stepped in as a surrogate father and introduced young George to the powerful Fairfax family.
I was actually reading about the Fairfaxes in the background materials. They weren't just rich, they basically owned a massive chunk of Virginia. They were like aristocratic titans.
Exactly. They controlled the Northern Neck Proprietary, which was over 5 million acres of land. And through Lawrence's connections, Washington gets a job. At the age of 16, he is out in the Shenandoah wilderness working as a professional surveyor for Lord Fairfax. 16. I mean, think about what you were doing at 16. It definitely wasn't navigating uncharted, hostile wilderness with a Gunter's chain and a compass. How exactly did surveying work out there? Because it sounds incredibly grueling.
It was physically brutal. You're dragging these heavy iron chains through dense forests, across freezing rivers and up mountainsides to measure property lines.
This miserable work.
Yeah, you were sleeping on the ground, dealing with aggressive wildlife, and surviving on whatever you can hunt or forage. But this is where the foundation of his character is poured. This wilderness experience toughened his body, but it also gave him an intimate, almost photographic knowledge of frontier geography.
Which comes in handy later.
Oh, definitely. He learned how to read the land, which would become his greatest asset as a military commander.
Yeah.
But it also puts him right on the collision course for his biggest blunder. So let's jump to 1753. He is in his early 20s, he's a major in the Virginia militia, and lieutenant governor sends him on a mission. He's supposed to march out into the Ohio Valley and politely warn the French Empire to pack up and leave territory that the British are claiming.
And this is where his immense ambition crashes headlong into his total lack of geopolitical experience. He goes out there, delivers a message, and the French politely decline to leave.
Shocker.
Right. So the next year, 1754, Washington is sent back out, this time with a small force of colonial militia and some indigenous allies, led by a Seneca chief known as the Half King. They are creeping through the woods, and they stumble upon a small French encampment.
And from the accounts, Washington decides to ambush them. They surround the camp, a firefight breaks out, and during this skirmish, a French diplomat named Joseph Coulon de Jumonville is killed. And not just killed in the crossfire, the historical accounts suggest the Half-King actually executed him.
Yeah, and the French are absolutely incensed. I mean, Jumonville was carrying diplomatic papers. To them, this wasn't an act of war, this was a war crime. So the French forces mobilize a massive retaliation. They track Washington down, and Washington's men hastily construct this incredibly pathetic circular wooden barricade that he ironically names Fort Necessity.
I looked at the diagrams of Fort Necessity in the records. He built it in the middle of a depression, like a bowl, right before a massive rainstorm. I mean, that is a tactical nightmare.
It was a catastrophic decision. The French and their native allies surround him. They take the high ground in the woods, and they just pour fire down into the fort. The rain is coming down in sheets, turning the ground inside the fort into this soup of mud and blood.
And that ruins their gunpowder, right?
Exactly. Washington's gunpowder gets soaking wet, rendering his muskets completely useless. He has absolutely no choice but to surrender.
Which is wild, because it's the only time in his entire military career that he surrenders. Yeah. But the real disaster happens when they hand him the paperwork. Let's talk about the Articles of Capitulation.
This is the turning point. The surrender document is written entirely in French. Washington did not speak, read, or understand a word of French.
Not a single word.
No. He has a translator with him, a Dutchman who speaks some French and some English, but the translation is just terrible. So in the pouring rain, by the light of a flickering candle, Washington signs the document just to get his surviving men out of there alive.
What he didn't realize is that the document explicitly used the French word l'assassinat. He literally signed a legal confession stating that he had assassinated a French diplomat.
Exactly. When those documents reach Paris and London, it is an international scandal. Washington's signature gives the French the perfect justification to escalate the conflict.
It's crazy.
It really is. This single skirmish in the muddy woods of Pennsylvania ignites the 7 Years' War, which Winston Churchill later called the first true world war because it eventually dragged in every major European power and was fought on multiple continents.
Okay, let me stop you there. This is like a wildly ambitious young intern at a massive corporation who misreads a foreign email attachment, clicks reply all, and accidentally triggers a catastrophic global lawsuit that bankrupts 2 countries. It is a world-altering screw-up.
It is the ultimate humiliation, and this is the moment where most people would have retreated into obscurity, moved to a farm, and never spoken of public service ever again.
I know I would have.
Right. But this highlights what we were talking about earlier, his ability to turn failure into a classroom. The very next year, 1755, the British send over a massive professional army under General Edward Braddock to take back the Ohio Valley. What does Washington do? He volunteers to go back out there as an aide to Braddock.
He voluntarily goes back to the scene of his greatest trauma, and this leads to the Battle of the Monongahela. The descriptions of this battle in the encyclopedias are like something out of a horror movie. Explain to me what happens when Braddock's traditional European army meets the reality of frontier warfare.
Well, you have to picture the British military doctrine of the time. They fight in tight, linear formations. Men stand shoulder to shoulder in bright red coats, firing their smoothbore muskets in synchronized volleys.
Right, the classic redcoat line.
Exactly. And this works brilliantly on the open, flat fields of Europe where you need a wall of lead to hit anything because smoothbore muskets are incredibly inaccurate. But Braddock marches this massive column right into the dense, claustrophobic forests of the frontier.
And the French and indigenous fighters are just waiting for them.
They ambush the British column from the ravines and the tree line. They aren't standing in lines. They are fighting from behind trees, using guerrilla tactics, picking off the British officers who are mounted on horseback and easily visible.
Slaughter.
Total slaughter. The British line collapses into total chaos. The soldiers are terrified, firing blindly into the woods, sometimes shooting their own men in the panic.
And where's Washington during all this? Because the medical details here are staggering. He shouldn't even be standing upright.
He was suffering from a brutal case of dysentery. He was so incredibly sick that he had to ride with a pillow strapped to his saddle just to endure the pain. But when the ambush happens and Braddock is mortally wounded, Washington rides directly into the absolute center of the chaos.
The sources say he had 2 different horses shot right out from under him. He falls to the dirt, gets up, finds another horse, mounts it, and just keeps going.
And after the battle, when he finally takes off his coat, he finds multiple bullet holes piercing his uniform and his hat. He was remarkably, almost supernaturally untouched.
That's unbelievable.
With the British chain of command completely decimated, it is the violently ill 23-year-old George Washington who rallies the panicked survivors. He organizes a rear guard, gathers the wounded, and orchestrates the retreat, saving the remnants of the army from total annihilation.
So he survives the physical brutality of the frontier, he survives the Monongahela, he gets a front row seat to the vulnerabilities of the vaunted British military, and then he resigns his commission and goes home to Mount Vernon. And this transitions us into a completely different phase of his life, because the threat he faces next isn't French musket fire, it's the financial strangulation of the British Empire.
Yeah, having survived the physical warfare, he now enters economic warfare. And this period is absolutely vital because this is what directly fuels his political radicalization.
Let's talk about his marriage first, because that is the catalyst for his new status. In 1759, he marries Martha Dandridge Custis, and she isn't just a widow, she is arguably the wealthiest widow in Virginia.
The marriage fundamentally transforms his life. He instantly gains control of her massive acreage and hundreds of enslaved people. Almost overnight, he becomes a prominent member of the Virginian planter aristocracy.
He hits the jackpot.
He really does. He moves into Mount Vernon, and he desperately wants to play the part of a sophisticated, wealthy English gentleman.
Right, but I was digging into his financial ledgers from this era, and the math is just bleak. He falls directly into a massive economic trap. How did this mercantilist system actually work? Because it seems like it was designed to bankrupt the colonists.
Well, mercantilism was an economic system where the colonies existed solely to enrich the mother country. For a Virginia planter like Washington, the system was called the consignment system. He would grow tobacco, which was an incredibly labor-intensive crop that rapidly depleted the soil, and he was forced by law to ship it to a merchant in London.
And in Washington's case, that was a man named Robert Carey, right?
Yes, Robert Carey.
So Washington puts his tobacco on a boat, sends it across the ocean, and then what? He just hopes for the best.
Essentially, yes. Robert Carey receives the tobacco in London and sells it. Carey gets to decide what the tobacco is worth based on the London market, and he takes a hefty commission.
Naturally.
But it gets worse. Washington is also ordering all of his luxury goods from Carey. He is ordering fine wine, custom-built carriages, tailored clothes, even busts of Alexander the Great. Carey buys these items in London, again taking a commission, and ships them back to Virginia.
So the London merchant is skimming off the top on both ends of the transaction. He dictates the price of the tobacco going in, and he dictates the price of the luxury goods going out.
Exactly. And the merchant routinely undervalued the colonial tobacco while inflating the cost of the British goods. It was a vicious cycle of debt. The colonists were essentially captive consumers. By 1764, despite marrying the wealthiest widow in the colony, Washington realizes he is 1,800 pounds in debt to Robert Carey. He is bleeding money.
I look at this differently than the traditional narrative. We are always taught that the American Revolution was born out of these lofty Enlightenment ideals of liberty, representation, and philosophical debates in taverns. But looking at these ledgers, was Washington actually just a frustrated businessman who was sick and tired of being ripped off by middle management in London? Was his political rebellion just financial desperation?
It is a fantastic question, and you are hitting on the core mechanism of historical change. The economic indignity is exactly what made the political philosophy deeply personal for him.
It wasn't just abstract.
Not at all. When Parliament later passes the Stamp Act or the Townshend Acts, Washington doesn't just read about it as a legal theory, he feels it in his wallet. The British weren't just taxing him, they were actively threatening his autonomy, his social standing, and his family's livelihood. The financial grievance became the fertile soil for the revolutionary ideals.
But he doesn't just sit around Mount Vernon complaining about his debt. He actually innovates his way out of the trap. And the logistics of what he did are fascinating.
He realized that continuing to grow tobacco was financial suicide. So between 1764 and 1766, he makes a radical, incredibly risky business pivot. He completely abandons tobacco as his primary cash crop.
Which was unheard of for a Virginia planter.
Totally unheard of. He shifts the entire massive operation at Mount Vernon to wheat.
Wait, why is wheat the magic bullet?
Because of the market dynamics. You can't just throw raw wheat on a ship to London, it would spoil. So he doesn't just grow wheat, he builds a highly advanced, water-powered grist mill. He starts grinding his own wheat into flour.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, and here's the genius part. He doesn't sell the flour to London, he sells it locally in the colonies, and he exports it to the West Indies. He completely severs his reliance on Robert Carey and the London credit cycle. He created his own independent vertical monopoly.
That is brilliant. But even though he fixed his own financial house, the resentment against the British system was permanently baked in. When the British start cracking down with taxes, Washington is the one urging Virginians to boycott British goods. He trains local militias. And that political anger eventually leads him to Philadelphia for the Continental Congress in the 1775.
And by the time the Second Continental Congress convenes, blood has already been spilled at Lexington and Concord. The colonies are in open rebellion. The Congress suddenly realizes they don't just need a debating society, they need a functioning army. And they need a single commander-in-chief to lead it.
And Washington shows up to the Congress literally wearing his military uniform, which is quite the subtle hint. But the briefs point out that choosing him wasn't just about his frontier experience. It was a calculated political maneuver by guys like John Adams.
It was a highly necessary political calculation. The rebellion had started in Massachusetts, in New England, but to fight a war against the British Empire, they desperately needed the wealthy, populous southern colonies to join the fight. Washington was a Virginian. By putting a Virginian at the head of a New England army, they physically bound the 13 colonies together.
Makes perfect sense.
Plus, he had the commanding physical presence. He was over 6 feet tall in an era when most men were much shorter, and he famously refused to take a salary for the job.
Which sounds incredibly noble, though he did insist they reimburse his expenses, and he kept meticulous track of every single dollar he spent over the next 8 years. But let's not romanticize what he was taking command of. The Continental Army was not an army.
No, it was a bureaucratic and logistical nightmare. He rode up to Cambridge, Massachusetts to take command of the forces besieging the British in Boston, and he was horrified. It was a poorly trained, completely undisciplined militia.
Just a bunch of guys with guns.
Literally. The men refused to take orders from officers they hadn't personally elected. They were constantly plagued by smallpox, dysentery, and mass desertion. And the biggest problem, their enlistments lasted for 1 year.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, as soon as a soldier finally learned how to fight, his contract was up and he went home to his farm.
He is facing the most disciplined, well-funded, professionally equipped fighting force on the planet, and his army is a revolving door of farmers with hunting muskets. I mean, he manages to force the British out of Boston, which is a great public relations victory. But then the reality of the war sets in. The British Armada shows up in New York in the summer of 1776, and Washington's army is systematically dismantled.
The defense of New York was a tactical disaster. The British launched massive amphibious landings, outflanked Washington repeatedly, and crushed the Continental Army. Washington is forced into a desperate, chaotic retreat across New Jersey.
By December of 1776, the situation is terminal. The army has shrunk to a few thousand exhausted, freezing men. The sources note that almost all of their enlistments expire on December 31st. The revolution is literally days away from completely evaporating, and this is where Washington executes the crossing of the Delaware River.
It is arguably the most famous moment of his military career, and it was born out of sheer, unadulterated desperation. He realizes he needs a massive, shocking victory to convince his men to re-enlist and to prove to the country that the army isn't dead. So, on Christmas night, he decides to attack the Hessian garrison German mercenaries fighting for the British at Trenton, New Jersey.
But let's look at the mechanics of this, because the famous painting of him standing proudly in the boat totally glosses over the logistics. How do you secretly move an entire army, horses, and thousands of pounds of artillery across the river in the middle of a winter storm.
It required incredible specialized skill. Washington relied on Colonel John Glover's regiment, who were seasoned mariners and fishermen from Marblehead, Massachusetts.
Okay, so professionals.
Right. These men had to navigate massive, flat-bottomed cargo boats through a river that was choked with chunks of floating ice. A violent nor'easter is blowing in, dumping freezing rain, sleet, and snow. The password for the operation was literally victory or death.
Talk about high stakes. And it takes hours longer than planned, right?
Oh yeah, they don't finish crossing until hours before dawn. But they march on Trenton, catching the Hessians completely by surprise, and it's a massive victory. Followed by another brilliant tactical strike at Princeton a week later.
Those two victories single-handedly resurrected the morale of the entire nation. But more importantly, it forced Washington into a profound strategic realization. After New York, he finally understood that he could not fight the British in traditional, open-field, European-style combat. If he tried, he would be destroyed. Let me jump in here because I was thinking about this strategy. We usually think of a victorious general as the guy who charges the field and knocks out the heavyweight champion. But Washington's strategy was basically Muhammad Ali's rope-a-dope. He wasn't trying to win by knockout. He realized he just had to keep the Continental Army alive long enough and bleed the British supply lines dry enough that the British Parliament would eventually get exhausted and go home.
That is a perfect analogy. The military term is a Fabian strategy, a war of attrition and avoidance. Washington realized a profound truth. The army was the revolution.
As long as they're standing, the war is not over.
Exactly. As long as the army existed in the field, the British could not claim victory, no matter how many cities they occupied. His genius was not in winning battles. I mean, he lost badly at Brandywine and Germantown. His genius was in his strategic patience. He knew exactly when to run away.
But avoiding battles meant enduring terrible conditions. Which brings us to the winter at Valley Forge in 1777. The briefs state they lost 2,000 to 3,000 men just to disease, exposure, and starvation. It was a crucible. But they didn't just sit there freezing. They fundamentally transformed how the army functioned. How did they actually do that?
The transformation was spearheaded by a Prussian military officer named Baron von Steuben. Steuben arrived at Valley Forge and was appalled by the lack of uniformity. Every regiment marched differently, loaded their weapons differently, and camped differently.
So how does a guy who barely speaks English fix an entire army in the middle of a blizzard?
He used a translator and he cursed a lot in multiple languages.
I love that.
But functionally, he standardized the mechanics of war. Take loading a musket. Previously, it might have taken a soldier 15 distinct motions to load and fire. Steuben analyzed the mechanics and reduced it to a standardized, highly efficient, 4-step process.
Wow, that's a massive upgrade.
Huge. He wrote a drill manual known as the Blue Book, which was used by the U.S. Army for decades. By the time they marched out of Valley Forge, they could finally maneuver with the speed and discipline of a professional European army.
While Steuben is fixing the infantry, Washington is operating on a completely different battlefield. Espionage. The sources highlight him as America's first spy master. And I want to dive deep into the Culper Ring because this is fascinating.
It is one of the most vital yet overlooked aspects of his leadership. Washington desperately needed actionable intelligence on British troop movements in occupied New York City. So he directed Major Benjamin Tallmadge to construct a highly compartmentalized civilian spy network, which became known as the Culper Ring.
And they weren't just passing whispered rumors in taverns, they were using high-level tradecraft. They used dead drops, burying messages in specific coves. But the technology of the cryptography is what really stands out. Can you explain the chemistry of the invisible ink they used?
They called it a sympathetic stain. It was developed by a doctor named James J. Unlike traditional invisible inks like lemon juice, which could be revealed just by holding the paper over a hot candle, this stain was a complex chemical reaction.
Oh, really?
Yeah, you would write the secret message with one chemical, likely a compound containing gallic acid. It would dry completely invisible. The recipient had to brush the paper with a specific corresponding chemical reagent, like an iron sulfate solution, to make the letter suddenly appear. If the British intercepted the letter and held it to a fire, they would see absolutely nothing.
That is wild. And even if they did reveal the ink, Tallmadge created a massive numerical code book. He took 763 common words and names and assigned them specific numbers. Washington himself was designated 711. They had a system so secure that Washington didn't even know the true identities of some of his own top spies.
And that intelligence network directly altered the course of the war. They uncovered a British plot to ambush the newly arrived French fleet at Newport, Rhode Island. Washington fed the British false intelligence, forcing them to call off the attack, saving his crucial French allies.
But despite his brilliance in espionage, he was totally blindsided by espionage from within his own inner circle. The treason of General Benedict Arnold.
Arnold was one of Washington's most aggressive, capable, and trusted battlefield commanders. But he felt deeply disrespected by Congress and was drowning in debt. In 1780, Arnold was given command of the fortress at West Point, which controlled the vital Hudson River. Arnold conspired with the British spy chief, Major John Andre, to surrender the fort to the British for a massive payout.
The sources mention that Washington found out about the treason just hours before Arnold escaped to a British ship. How did Washington react in that moment? Because finding out your most trusted general is selling you out could break a person's spirit.
The accounts say Washington was momentarily emotionally shattered. He reportedly turned to Lafayette and asked, "Whom can we trust now?"
Heartbreaking.
But then his logistical brain took over. He didn't panic publicly. He immediately dispatched troops to secure the fort, completely reorganize the defensive perimeters, and stabilize the region before the British could exploit the vulnerability. It was a masterclass in crisis management under extreme psychological stress.
And all of that endurance, the espionage, the retreats, the surviving it all culminates in 1781 at Yorktown, with the massive support of the French General Rochambeau, Lafayette, and crucially, the French Navy blocking the coast. Washington traps the British Army under General Cornwallis and forces a surrender. The major fighting is over. The impossible has happened.
It was an astonishing military triumph. But if we look at the historical record, defeating the British isn't actually what made Washington an immortal historical figure. What he did after the fighting stopped is what truly shocked the globe.
Which brings us to a moment of unimaginable tension. We talked about surrendering at Fort Necessity, but now we have to talk about him surrendering his own absolute power. Because before the peace treaty is even signed, Washington has to defuse a ticking time bomb inside his own camp, the Newburgh Conspiracy.
This is one of the most perilous moments in American history. It's early 1783. The army is encamped at Newburgh, New York. The fighting is largely over, but the soldiers and the officers haven't been paid in months. The civilian Congress in Philadelphia is completely bankrupt.
So the officers circulate an anonymous letter. They are furious. They basically threaten that if Congress doesn't pay them, the army will either refuse to disband when peace is declared, or worse, they will march on Philadelphia and take the money by force.
It was the blueprint for a military coup. If the Continental Army marched on its own government, the American experiment would have ended in a military dictatorship before the ink on the peace treaty was even dry.
That's terrifying to think about.
Washington knows he has to stop this, but he can't use force against his own hardened officers. He has to use pure psychological theater.
I read the account of what he did, and it literally gave me chills. He unexpectedly walks into the officers' meeting. They are angry, they are hostile. He gives a prepared speech, begging them not to open the floodgates of civil discord. But the speech doesn't really land. They are still glaring at him. So what does he do?
He pulls out a letter from a member of Congress to read to them, but the text is small. So Washington reaches into his pocket and pulls out a pair of reading glasses. None of his officers had ever seen him wear glasses. He was always the strong, infallible commander. As he puts them on, he says, "Gentlemen, you will permit me to put on my spectacles, for I have not only grown gray, but almost blind in the service of my country."
It's an incredibly calculated moment of vulnerability.
And it broke them. These battle-hardened officers, men who had survived Valley Forge and musket fire, began to openly weep. In a single sentence, he shamed them out of mutiny by reminding them that no one had sacrificed more for the cause than he had, and he was still submitting to civilian rule. The conspiracy collapsed instantly.
And he follows that up in December 1783 with an act that stunned the world. He walks into the State House in Annapolis, Maryland, where Congress was meeting, and he voluntarily resigns his military commission. He gives the power back.
To understand the magnitude of this, you really have to look at history. In the 18th century, victorious generals simply did not walk away from power. Julius Caesar, Oliver Cromwell history is littered with military leaders who used their victorious armies to crown themselves emperors or dictators.
Right, it's the standard playbook.
When King George III in London heard a rumor that Washington planned to resign and return to his farm, the king reportedly said, if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world.
Think about the psychology required to do that. Imagine building a startup from scratch, fighting tooth and nail for 8 years against a massive corporate monopoly, and the moment your company goes public and you are universally beloved. You just drop the keys on the desk and walk out the door. He returns to Mount Vernon. He wants nothing more than to sit under his vine and fig tree. So why doesn't he stay there? Why risk a completely flawless historical reputation to wade back into the absolute mud of politics?
Because he realized his life's work was unraveling. The new nation was operating under a governing document called the Articles of Confederation, and it was a complete failure.
The encyclopedias say Washington called it a rope of sand. Why was it so ineffective?
Well, because it was designed to be weak. The colonists had just fought a war against a tyrannical central power in London, so they created a national government with almost zero power.
An overcorrection.
Massive overcorrection. There was no executive branch. There was no president. The Congress had absolutely no power to levy taxes. They could only politely ask the states for money, which the states usually just ignored. The states were printing their own worthless paper money and putting tariffs on each other's goods.
So it wasn't a nation. It was a squabbling committee of 13 independent countries. And the breaking point comes with Shays' Rebellion in 1786.
Right. Daniel Shays, a Revolutionary War veteran, leads a massive armed uprising of indebted farmers in Massachusetts. They start shutting down the courts to stop their farms from being foreclosed on. The federal government is so incredibly weak that it cannot even raise a military force to put the rebellion down.
Wow.
It proved to everyone, especially Washington, that the country was teetering on the edge of total anarchy.
So the political leaders realize they have to scrap the Articles and start over. They call for a constitutional convention in Philadelphia in 1787. And they basically beg Washington to come.
They knew that if Washington wasn't in the room, the American public would never trust whatever document came out of it. His personal prestige was the only currency the new government had. He went reluctantly. He was unanimously elected to preside over the convention. He rarely spoke during the debates, but his silent, imposing presence sitting at the front of the room kept the delegates focused and forced them to compromise.
Let me pause and ask a somewhat cynical question. Did he really go just out of pure patriotism, or was it a matter of ego? I mean, he spent 8 years building this country. Did he just not want his name attached to a failed project?
I think it is inextricably both. Washington's ego and his sense of legacy were deeply intertwined with the survival of the United States. If the country fractured into regional confederacies or was reconquered by Britain or France, his 8 years of suffering in the war would mean nothing. History would remember him as the leader of a failed, momentary rebellion. He had to save the legal framework to secure his own immortal legacy.
And the irony is, by lending his presence to create this new Constitution, he unintentionally created a job specifically designed for himself, a job that had no historical precedent whatsoever, the presidency.
When the Constitution was ratified, there was never a doubt about who would be the first executive. The Electoral College unanimously elected him president in 1789. It is the only time in U.S. history a president has been elected unanimously, and he did it twice.
He essentially becomes the beta tester for the executive branch. I want to look at this through the lens of a modern executive. Think of the Oval Office as a brand new tech platform. There is no manual. There are no terms of service. Every single action Washington takes becomes the mandatory template for the next 2 centuries.
Exactly. Even the simplest things required massive debate. What do you call the leader of a republic? The Senate, led by John Adams, wanted these absurdly majestic European-style titles. They proposed things like His Highness, the President of the United States of America and Protector of their Liberties.
Which sounds like a character from Game of Thrones.
Right. It sounded monarchical. Washington wisely recognized that if the presidency looked like a monarchy, the people would reject it. He insisted on the simplest, most rounded title possible, Mr. President. It established immediately that the executive was a citizen, not a sovereign.
He also creates the cabinet, which isn't explicitly detailed in the Constitution in the way we know it, and he does something that modern presidents rarely do. He intentionally surrounds himself with brilliant people who completely disagree with each other. He puts Alexander Hamilton in as Secretary of the Treasury and Thomas Jefferson as Secretary of State.
And those two men fundamentally despised each other's vision for the future of America. It was a proxy war for the soul of the nation taking place right inside Washington's cabinet.
Let's drill into that conflict because it defines his entire presidency. What exactly were Hamilton and Jefferson fighting over?
It boiled down to the scope of federal power and the nature of the economy. Hamilton wanted a powerful, centralized federal government. He wanted to assume all the state debts from the war to build a strong national credit system. He wanted a national bank, and he envisioned America as an industrial, mercantile powerhouse with strong ties to Britain.
And Jefferson is just horrified by this.
Deeply horrified. Jefferson, who had spent years in France, viewed Hamilton's plans as a betrayal of the Revolution. He believed Hamilton was trying to install a British-style aristocracy. Jefferson envisioned a decentralized republic composed of independent agrarian farmers with heavy sympathies toward the French Revolution. Their infighting was vicious. They were secretly funding rival newspapers to slander each other.
Wow, so how does Washington manage this toxic environment?
Washington's greatest asset as president was his strict adherence to nonpartisanship. He acted as the indispensable anchor. He would listen to Jefferson's constitutional objections, he would read Hamilton's massive economic reports, and he would synthesize the best path forward. Ultimately, he tended to side with Hamilton's financial policies, like signing the bill to create the first bank of the United States, because his experience in the war taught him that a nation without strong credit and revenue is defenseless. But he refused to officially align with Hamilton's emerging Federalist Party.
And he proved he was willing to use that newly established federal power during the Whiskey Rebellion in 1794. This is a crazy moment. Farmers in western Pennsylvania start violently attacking tax collectors because Hamilton put an excise tax on distilled spirits.
For frontier farmers, whiskey wasn't just a drink, it was literally used as currency because hard cash was so scarce. They viewed the tax as fundamentally unfair. But Washington knew that if the new government allowed citizens to violently ignore federal tax laws, the Constitution would become just as worthless as the Articles of Confederation.
So the sitting president of the United States puts his military uniform back on, gets back on a horse, and mobilizes a militia of 13,000 men. That is a larger army than he commanded at Yorktown. He personally rides out to Pennsylvania to crush the insurgency.
The sheer show of overwhelming force caused the rebellion to collapse without a major battle. It was a vital precedent. The federal government had both the constitutional authority and the physical will to enforce its laws.
He's also setting massive precedents in foreign policy. The French Revolution devolves into a massive war between France and Britain. Jefferson's faction demands the U.S. support France because France helped us during our revolution. Hamilton's faction demands neutrality or leaning toward Britain for economic stability. What does Washington do?
He issues the Proclamation of Neutrality. He recognized a cold, hard fact. The United States was a fragile infant. The country was drowning in debt. The military was virtually non-existent. And getting dragged into a European superpower war would destroy the nation.
And he cements that neutrality with the Jay Treaty in 1795.
Which was incredibly unpopular. The treaty normalized trade relations with Britain and finally got British troops to evacuate forts in the American Northwest. But it failed to address the British seizing American ships. The Jeffersonians burned effigies of John Jay in the streets, but Washington absorbed the public hatred and pushed the treaty through because it guaranteed a decade of peace and prosperous trade, giving the U.S. time to grow strong.
He also establishes the concept of executive privilege during the treaty debate, right? The House of Representatives demands to see all the executive branch's internal diplomatic papers regarding the treaty.
And Washington flatly refuses. He tells them that the Constitution gives the treaty-making power to the President and the Senate, not the House. It's exactly like a modern CEO telling a lower-tier management committee that they don't have the legal clearance to see the board of directors' strategic documents. He laid down the absolute boundary of executive independence.
And then, after 2 terms, he stops. He realizes that if he dies in office, it will set a precedent that the presidency is a lifetime appointment, like a king. So he refuses a 3rd term and issues his farewell address in 1796.
It remains one of the most prophetic documents in American history. He doesn't just say goodbye, he issues stark, terrifying warnings. He warns that political parties will inevitably lead to toxic, revenge-driven factionalism that will tear the country apart. He warns against regionalism, the North pitting itself against the South, and he warns against foreign entanglements, urging the nation to engage in commerce, but to avoid permanent alliances.
He basically diagnosed every major political illness the country would suffer from for the next 2 centuries. But as we move into the next segment, we have to talk about the areas where his own life suffered from deep, uncomfortable contradictions, because we cannot talk about his legacy without looking squarely at the historical record regarding human rights.
Exactly. And looking directly at the detailed sources provided, we see a stark dichotomy. While Washington was forging the architecture of modern liberty on the public stage, his private ledgers and his estate were entirely dependent on the institution of forced labor.
I want to be very clear here for everyone listening. We are strictly exploring the historical facts and timelines as they are documented in the encyclopedic records. We aren't here to impose modern moral frameworks or take political sides. We're simply looking at how Washington navigated this reality. And the reality is massive. The sources state that during his lifetime, at least 577 enslaved people lived and worked at Mount Vernon.
Yes, Washington's involvement with slavery began incredibly early. He inherited his first 10 enslaved individuals when he was just 11 years old upon his father's death. When he married Martha, he gained control of over 80 dour slaves from the Custis estate. Over his life, he purchased many more to fuel the economic engine of Mount Vernon.
But the sources also detail that his perspective on the institution was not static. It evolved significantly, and surprisingly, that evolution didn't start with morality. It started with economics.
That is what the ledgers reveal. Prior to the Revolution, his views mirrored those of the typical Virginian planter class. He viewed enslaved people purely through the lens of property and economic output. But when he made that brilliant shift from growing tobacco to milling wheat, he inadvertently created a labor surplus. Wheat simply does not require the massive year-round gang labor that tobacco does. He suddenly realized the economic inefficiency of maintaining such a massive enslaved workforce.
And then the revolution happens. He is fighting a war based on the rhetoric that all men are entitled to liberty, while simultaneously holding hundreds of human beings in bondage.
The contradiction became impossible to ignore, especially when you factor in the influence of people like the Marquis de Lafayette. Lafayette, a French aristocrat who became like an adopted son to Washington, became a passionate abolitionist and actively pressured Washington to experiment with freeing his slaves and paying them as tenant farmers.
By the 1780s and 1790s, the sources show a clear shift in his private correspondence. He privately states that he wishes to see a plan adopted by the legislature to gradually abolish slavery.
He felt a profound internal tension. However, there is a massive gulf between his private letters and his public actions. As president, he remained completely silent on the issue of abolition.
Why the silence? If he privately wanted it to end, why not use his unmatched prestige to force the issue?
Because of his obsession with the survival of the fragile Union, he believed, and probably correctly so, that if he forced the issue of abolition on the national stage, the Southern states would immediately secede, the Constitution would fracture, and the United States would violently collapse. He continually prioritized national political unity and his own economic stability over the immediate freedom of enslaved people.
The ultimate culmination of this tension is found in his last will and testament. The sources highlight that he was highly unusual among the founding generation of Virginian planters and what he did next.
In his will, he explicitly arranged for the emancipation of all the enslaved people he owned outright. However, he stipulated that this emancipation was to occur upon the death of his wife, Martha.
Wait, why wait for Martha to die?
Because of the complex legal status of the dour slaves, he did not legally own the slaves that came with Martha's first marriage. They belonged to the Custis estate and had to be passed down to her heirs. Over the decades, his slaves and the dour slaves had extensively intermarried. If he freed his own slaves immediately, he would be forcibly breaking up dozens of families, so he delayed it. Though it is worth noting that Martha actually signed the Deed of Manumission to free Washington's slaves a year after his death, reportedly because she felt unsafe surrounded by people whose freedom depended on her dying.
Wow. He also mandated in the will that the estate provide funds to feed and clothe the elderly and to educate the young, freed children so they could learn a trade. It is a complex, deeply fraught legacy. The man who laid the foundation for democratic liberty could not extract himself from the system of subjugation. And we see a similarly tragic complexity in his relationship with indigenous peoples.
The historical briefs describe a very mixed, often contradictory legacy regarding Native Americans. On one hand, as president, he articulated a policy hoping that indigenous tribes would assimilate into an American agricultural society. He did not advocate for the immediate wholesale confiscation of all tribal lands without treaties.
But the reality of a rapidly expanding, land-hungry new nation demanded that land. When tribes naturally resisted the encroachment of white settlers, Washington responded with devastating military force.
The primary example cited in the sources is the Sullivan Expedition of 1779 during the Revolutionary War. The Iroquois Confederacy in upstate New York had allied with the British and were raiding frontier settlements. Washington ordered General John Sullivan to launch a massive scorched earth campaign.
And the goal wasn't just to win a battle. It was total destruction.
Sullivan's forces systematically burned over 40 Iroquois villages to the ground. They destroyed thousands of bushels of winter crops, orchards, and food stores, effectively breaking the power of the Iroquois Confederacy and causing widespread starvation during the following winter.
Which earned Washington a terrifying title from the Seneca leader, Tannac Harrison. He called Washington Cartocarius. The translation of that is town destroyer or devourer of villages.
And the striking historical footnote is that this title was originally given to Washington's great-grandfather, John Washington, in the 17th century for his actions against Native Americans. George Washington's life was inextricably bound to the brutal realities of westward expansion. You cannot fully comprehend the architecture of the United States without grappling with the violence and subjugation that cleared the ground for it.
Which brings us to the final chapter of his life. We've stripped away the marble, but now we have to strip away a few persistent myths before we look at his death. First off, the teeth.
The most famous myth in American history, Washington's wooden teeth.
The sources definitively crush this. He did not have wooden teeth. He suffered from horrific dental decay his entire adult life, likely exacerbated by the mercury-based medicines he was given for diseases like malaria and dysentery. By his inauguration, he only had one natural tooth left.
He was in agonizing pain constantly, often relying on laudanum just to function. But his dentures were highly complex. They were made of lead, brass, carved hippopotamus ivory, cow bone, and actual human teeth.
And the ledgers show that he purchased some of those human teeth from unnamed enslaved people at Mount Vernon, which is a chilling detail of the era's medical practices. And what about the cherry tree? I cannot tell a lie.
Complete fiction. That story was invented whole cloth by a biographer named Mason Locke Weems shortly after Washington's death. Weems wanted to create an inspirational, almost mythological figure to teach morality to children. It has no basis in historical fact.
So if we discard the myths, we are left with the brutal reality of December 1799. Washington has been retired at Mount Vernon for a few years. On December 12th, he goes out on horseback to inspect his farms, and he stays out for 5 hours in a miserable mix of freezing rain, snow, and hail.
He comes back to the mansion completely soaked. But because he has dinner guests waiting and he is ever the strict, punctual gentleman, he refuses to change out of his wet clothes. He sits through dinner in damp, freezing garments. The next morning, he wakes up with a severe sore throat. By the early hours of December 14th, he's struggling to breathe.
And what follows is a medically horrific sequence of events. The irony here is thick. The man who survived the wilderness, survived French ambushes, dodged British cannonballs, and outlasted the entire British Empire is ultimately taken down by the standard medical practices of his own doctors. Explain what they actually did to him.
Well, 3 physicians are called in, including his longtime friend, Dr. James Craik. Modern medical historians believe Washington was suffering from acute epiglottitis, a severe bacterial infection that causes the tissue at the back of the throat to swell, blocking the airway. But in 1799, the prevailing medical theory was humorism.
Right, the idea that the body has 4 humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and disease, is just an imbalance of those fluids.
Exactly. So to cure the inflammation, the doctors believed they needed to violently purge his system. The primary method was bloodletting. They opened a vein in his arm and began draining his blood. And they didn't just do it once. Over the course of 12 hours, they bled him 4 separate times.
The records state they removed approximately 5 pints of blood. For context, the human body only holds about 10 pints. They drained half of his lifeblood while he was fighting a massive infection. What does that actually do to the body?
It induces hypovolemic shock. With half his blood volume gone, his heart cannot pump enough oxygen to his vital organs. His blood pressure bottoms out. He becomes incredibly weak. On top of that, they administered toxic purgatives.
Calomel, right. Let's be clear about what calomel actually is.
Calomel is mercurous chloride. It is a highly toxic, mercury-based laxative designed to force the body to violently empty the bowels. They also applied a blister of cantharides made from crushed Spanish flies to his throat, hoping to draw the disease out through the skin. They were essentially torturing a dying man under the guise of medicine.
But even as he's suffocating and being drained of his blood, his stoicism is almost unfathomable. The sources say he calmly checked his own pulse. He thanked the doctors for their efforts. He turned to Dr. Craik and said, "I die hard, but I am not afraid to go."
His final words were simply, "'Tis well." What is so fascinating about his final hours is how meticulously he stage-managed his own exit. He ensured his will was easily found, guaranteeing the emancipation of his slaves. He asked for his duplicate diaries to be secured. He faced his mortality with the exact same rigid, disciplined Republican virtue that he practiced his entire public life.
Which brings us back to that terrifying request we started this show with, the fear of being buried alive. He forced Tobias Lear to promise to wait 3 days.
It was a very real, visceral phobia for him, known as taphophobia. In an era before stethoscopes or brainwave monitoring, accidental live burial was a legitimate, documented occurrence.
But think about the psychology of that. Washington was the ultimate control freak. He spent half a century meticulously orchestrating his posture, his public image, his army's logistics, the complex politics of his cabinet, and the very foundation of a new republic. He willed a nation into existence. But his final dying anxiety was about losing control over his own physical body in the dark. It is such a stunningly vulnerable human detail for a man who has been turned into marble.
It completely humanizes him. He leaves behind a legacy that is unparalleled. He was eulogized by Henry Lee as first in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen. And for the bicentennial in 1976, Congress posthumously promoted him to General of the Armies of the United States.
Meaning he outranks every five-star general in history. He could never, legally, be outranked by any officer ever again.
He was the indispensable man. Without his specific combination of ambition, resilience, and restraint, the United States simply does not survive its infancy.
We have covered a massive amount of ground today. We've traced the path of a poorly educated teenage surveyor dragging chains through the freezing Shenandoah wilderness. We've seen a desperately retreating general using espionage and a ragged army to exhaust an empire. We've watched a reluctant politician invent the American presidency from scratch, manage incredibly toxic factions, and then do the unthinkable, willingly walk away from absolute power twice. And we've looked unblinkingly at the profound, tragic contradictions of a man who fought for liberty while holding human beings in bondage. It is a complicated, messy, incredibly rich history. It's something to chew on the next time you hold a $1 bill. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.